Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to take a look at a very interesting book that will be of great value to everyone watching this program. Our guest today wrote this book. Professor David Betz is a professor of war in the modern world in the Department of War Studies, King's College in London. He's also a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Center. He's written 4 books, and his most recent book is The Guarded Age: Fortification in the 21st Century. Professor Betz, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's start off with just a very basic question. Why did you decide to write The Guarded Age: Fortification in the 21st Century?
Well, there are 2 reasons, really. One is, like a lot of people, I just have a lifelong fascination with fortifications and castles, going back to childhood and making snow forts and dreaming up castles in the sky, like many of us do. But the real genesis of the book, I'd say, had to be in 2010. In the summer of 2010, I went to Afghanistan with NATO as a civilian advisor, and when you visit a war zone like Afghanistan as a civilian, you're really only in the country, in fact, kind of a name only. For the most part, you're going from one very heavily guarded, fortified army base to another. You rarely exit the bases. And so I just became very interested in the fortification systems that I could see all around me. And I had an inkling that there was something important about what that represented and what that meant, which wasn't being covered in the literature. And I thought, this is interesting, and I should tell the story of contemporary fortifications.
So how do you define fortifications? I guess everybody has a concept in mind. If we talk about a fortification, how would you describe it? Are we just talking about a fort? Are we talking about something that has a wall around it? All of the above and a little more? How would you define that?
It's actually a surprisingly complicated question. When you're first asked the question, I think most people's first instinct is to think that the answer is quite easy. Something comes to mind if you ask people to imagine a fortification. They probably imagine something like the Disney castle, or maybe a ruined castle that they saw on a holiday or something like that. And they're rarely likely, though, to picture much of the infrastructure which comprises daily 21st century life, the backdrop of daily 21st century life. So I would say one of the problems with defining fortification is that they have so many purposes. Part of their purpose is military, part of it is symbolic. They're neither defensive nor offensive. Sometimes they're used for offensive purposes, very often for defensive. So I tend to define fortifications very broadly as a piece of militarized architecture which is intended to force an enemy into doing something, typically into moving in a way which they wouldn't otherwise do. So it causes them to go round, to slow down, or potentially to conduct a siege operation or an attack, which puts the defenders in a position of some advantage. So it's simply a piece of securitized or militarized architecture. I also think it's really important, though, I tend to talk less about individual fortifications, individual forts, and more about what I call fortified strategic complexes, which are essentially networks of forts or combinations of forts with other instruments of power, other arms, for instance, but also surveillance and other devices, which together form a strategic complex that can cover a very large area. It might cover the terrain of a whole city. In the case of the South China Sea, the Chinese have developed a series of fortified island reefs. But the importance of these really is that you have to look at them as a network, as a complex of fortifications, rather than as strictly an individual structure on its own.
When I think of fortifications or walls or barriers, the first one that comes to mind is the Great Wall of China, which stretches 4,000 miles, whatever it is. The other are some of the walls that they have in Israel between the Israelis, the settlements, and the Palestinians in that area. And then, of course, the third one is this heated debate we've had in the United States over whether we need a wall between Mexico and the United States. You can take any of the three you would like, but if we take the wall between Mexico and the United States, a lot of the strategic thinking people are saying you don't need a wall, or you need it in certain areas, but you can have a lot of surveillance, you can have cameras, drones, those types of things. How would that, let's just take the US, for example, how would that tie into your book? And what would your suggestion be to develop a security complex along the US-Mexican border?
Yeah, sure. The U.S.-Mexican border is the walls that you mentioned there, particularly the Great Wall of China and the U.S.-Mexico border. I'll leave aside the Israeli security barrier for the moment. There is something common to those things. If you think morphologically, the Great Wall of China is a continuous, more or less continuous wall built over a long period, but more or less a continuous wall that followed the periphery of the Chinese world. It was effectively a border installation, and its intention was to filter the traffic between the governed sovereign Chinese zone and the ungoverned exterior barbarous zone, to regulate and to filter traffic between those two spaces. And in that sense, there is a strong similarity with the US-Mexico border, which of course is a far less militarized border. The United States and Mexico are not at a state level, are not hostile to each other. So this border fortification, proposed border-fortification, in fact, actually, already a good amount of the US-Mexico border is walled, but the proposed fortification is a bit like the China Wall in its linearity, in its length, and to some extent on its supposed function as a filter between sovereign zones. The US-Mexico border, however, is a really good example, not so much of it's not strictly a military structure. It wouldn't make much sense as a defensive structure. In that, it's really an anti-migration barrier, and these are very difficult to make work. And the problem is fundamentally that a wall is, there's nothing special about a wall that is unguarded. If you have a 20-foot wall, then somebody with a 21-foot ladder can defeat that wall. There are plenty of ways to get over or through or under. And if there are people on one side of the wall who very desperately want to get to the other side of the wall, the wall itself might slow them down or somewhat mitigate the traffic, might force them to cross in different areas, but it's not really going to hold them off unless you physically guard the barrier and apprehend or halt people at that point where they are slowed by the structure. That is the problem with a very long border like the United States, because you can't simply, the wall on its own is not going to perform this function. And so your interlocutors or others who remark that you may as well do this with other sorts of devices surveillance devices, whether airborne cameras or fixed cameras or things like that on natural routes, is probably correct. They would be nearly as, not much better at slowing, but they would be just as good at alerting security forces to the presence of migrants who would then respond. So if it's not guarded, it's not really going to do much. It could do. I mean, if you think 30 years ago, there was a border running down the middle of Europe, mostly through Germany, but which we've once called the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was also an anti-migration barrier. In this case, it was designed to prevent people from moving from leaving the east to the west. But nonetheless, it was a barrier that was really not designed primarily as a militarily functional defensive instrument, but rather as a migration barrier. And it worked extremely well, but it did so because all along that border, to be halted or slowed on that border meant that it was heavily guarded throughout, and very violently, in fact. So it was so dangerous to pass that within a few short years of the construction of the Iron Curtain, there was virtually no one going across it without the knowledge and permission of the people who built it. So anti-migration barriers can work, but what makes them work is the political will to guard them, and I suspect that is not present in the case of the U.S.-Mexico border. That is the intention. I should say, though, that these sorts of walls are extremely common. It's not just the United States, of course, rather more quietly, but the border fortifications of Europe now are very, very extensive. They amount to a series of barriers, walls, fences, and the like, of well over just under 2,000 kilometers now, with more being built all the time. One could point to many, many examples of this in the contemporary world.
They certainly are. They certainly are moving in that direction. There's no doubt about it. But we're going to come back in just a moment and talk about that. Sure. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're talking about fortifications and border walls, I should say. And my guest is an expert on this topic. Professor David Betz is professor of war in the modern world in the Department of War Studies, King's College in London. His most recent book is The Guarded Age, Fortification in the 21st Century. Professor Betz, we're talking about this. If we could, how would you look at the future, or how should we look at the future as far as using physical fortresses, walls as barriers, those types of things? Where can we substitute some of the most modern technology of using drones and different items like that, and move away from the brick and mortar types of activities? As you said, a 10-foot border wall between the U.S. and Mexico just begs for an 11-foot ladder. So it can be overcome very, very easily. So where would you see the world going, or where should we be going?
Let me try to tackle where should we be going later, and just take on the first bit. divided into three parts. The military use of fortifications. Then secondarily, I'll talk briefly about changes in the urban landscape, which are largely driven by counterterrorism mitigation. And thirdly, I would look at private or corporate fortification. So starting with the military, to a very surprising extent, contemporary warfare is dominated by positional attack and by the use of strong fortifications. This is much to the surprise, frankly, of many people in the military sphere who, for a generation at least, have thought that the mainstream of warfare was much more maneuverist and highly mobile, involving advanced sensors and the ability to strike very precisely, and so on and so forth. You mentioned the advent of drones, of course, which one might see as a continuation of this. But if you look at the Russo-Ukraine conflict right now, probably its climactic moment was this summer, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive was completely stymied by Russian field fortifications in the south, in the Zaporozhye region, primarily. These were fortifications that looked essentially very similar to those that you might have seen in the First World War. They were, or in the Second World War, they were a mix of continuous, very lengthy, multi-hundred kilometers in length anti-tank ditches in successive rows, heavily mined, with heavily fortified, deep dug fighting positions and companies and size fighting positions and strong points and so on and so forth. That all looked rather reminiscent of war of 100 years ago, and less so of what we imagined 21st century warfare was going to look like. I'll also point to the more recent Gaza conflict, which of course, starts off with, on October 7th, with the failure of the Israeli border system, which you referred to earlier. Since 2006, or thereabouts, Israel has had a continuous linear border security system on Gaza and around the West Bank. What happened on October 7th was a failure of that system, which seems, so far as we understand, to have failed because the IDF, astonishingly, not that the system was not in itself powerful, but it wasn't guarded. They simply had, I think fair to say, they dropped the ball on the monitoring and the response to incursion by Hamas. Subsequently, what the Israelis have done, aside from, I'll get to the combat in Gaza itself in a moment, but this has caused the Israelis to revisit their fortification strategy very strongly. And they're not thinking that fortifications are obsolescent. Rather, they are thinking they need to do it. They need to redouble both their border efforts and probably also the fortification of individual communities. So rather isolated small towns or isolated kibbutzes will probably in the near future, also feature be walled and guarded systems. The form in which this may take, well, we haven't yet seen, but it's probably, I would not be surprised if it did not look something like what the Anglo-Saxons built when they were trying to defend their towns and cities against Viking incursion. The parallels are very similar. So on the military level, there is a surprising renaissance of fortification technologies, and military engineering has now a prominence and sophistication in military affairs that is kind of surprising given the way we've talked about it up until recent times. The urban infrastructure is also very interesting. Most citizens will be familiar with the way in which our cities have been reshaped in order to mitigate the potential threat of terror attacks, specifically ramming attacks when a vehicle uses its own weight and momentum to plow through crowds of people, injuring and killing, or car bombs or truck bombs in crowded places. And in response to and additionally, sorry, I should add also the fear of active shooter attacks, something like the Mumbai style attack, which occurred in 2008, and examples of which have occurred also elsewhere in the world, notably Paris a few years ago. So in response to these sorts of threats, what's happened is changes in the urban landscape that are designed to harden crowded places in order to provide basically refuges or areas that are resistant to ballistic threats, that are bulletproof essentially, and to prevent the access to certain facilities, sporting facilities, hospitals, hotels, and the like, of vehicles that could be carrying explosives to create standoff distance, so that if an explosive goes off, it goes off as far away as possible from the vital structure. The best example of this are probably American embassies, which the two very significant ones I would direct your viewers to are the new American embassy in London, which is essentially an inverted castle sitting on an artificial hill in the center of London. It is guarded by a moat, by walls hidden away in hedges. So it is basically an armored cube suspended in the sky on a diagrid structure to prevent it against to protect its the diplomats inside against the kinds of threats that I've just outlined. Another is the soon to be finished American embassy in Beirut, which is actually located outside of Beirut because it's very difficult to create standoff distance inside a city because of real estate costs. So they've located the embassy about 10 kilometers out of the center on a hilltop, and the embassy looks like a Crusader castle. It's got a continuous wall around it. It has a dungeon. It's done in a modern style. It looks more Star Trek than medieval, but it is fundamentally a highly fortified walled compound that has a lot of similarity to the many medieval castles, which are still to this day to be found in that area. A lot of these structures are designed to blend in. One's eye kind of looks past them because the structures are designed to look like something else. Street furniture, for example, benches, which are perfectly serviceable benches, but they're not really designed to be sat on. They're not designed to be very, very powerful anti-vehicle barriers and the like. The Washington Monument, for example, another example, is a very heavily guarded structure. But it's done so through what's known as hard landscaping. These are elevation changes in the landscape around the structure that prevent vehicles from getting close to it. And so you wouldn't notice that if you go look at the Washington Monument, you see the Washington Monument and a nice landscaped garden around it. But that landscaped garden is a fortified structure.
It certainly is. And it's just incredible how we take all of this for granted. I know years ago, I was at the 38th parallel between North Korea and South Korea, which is one of the most heavily fortified areas in the world. And it became very apparent as you got closer and closer that with the machine gun nests nestled in the hillside and that type of thing, it's just incredible how we take all of this for granted. Yet these are very well fortified, very well protected, hopefully places where we can go visit and be safe there. Well, Professor Betz, I can't believe it. We ran out of time. This is a fascinating topic, but I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
I'm delighted. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.
How it does contracts and how it builds out programs. And that oversight is in and of itself extremely wasteful, right? And the phrase that somebody told me was that you in government, you can waste as much money as you want in this purpose of preventing people from wasting money, right? So as long as you say, I'm stopping fraud and waste, you can fraudulently waste as much money as you want. And so, if we had more time, I would tell you a little bit more about the F-35 and how it's actually now being considered kind of a
We'll
success.
pick that up in the next interview for sure. I mean, Dr. Robert Farley, you always have such a unique insight into these issues. That's why I love having you on the show. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.